Hello friends, about of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. My name is Lorelei. At least, that's what my clients call me. To them, it's seductive and mysterious, fitting the kind of woman they're paying for. My job? Escorting. But unlike most escorts, I cater to a particular clientele of people with unique conditions. You might call them supernatural. I call them medical anomalies. Take werewolves, for example. They're not the snarling beasts you see in horror flicks. It's hypertrichosis, a rare genetic disorder causing excessive hair growth. They live in constant discomfort, their bodies struggling to regulate temperature under all that fur. The so-called change is just an extreme endocrine response to stress, paired with acute psychosis during full moons. Some of them come to me just to talk, needing someone who won't recoil at their appearance. Then there are the ghouls, who aren't rotting corpses but suffer from a rare condition called necrosis syndrome, a slow, painful deterioration of the flesh, often brought on by autoimmune disorders. They crave companionship, because they've been cast out by everyone else. You'd think the smell would bother me, but after a while you stop noticing. These encounters aren't normally sexual, they just want to be held by someone. Essential oils come in handy here, and the Fae, they're the most tragically human of all, born with extreme albinism. Their translucent skin and sensitivity to light have earned them their mythical reputation. It's heartbreaking, really. Their supposed allergy to iron is a misunderstanding of severe anemia that leaves them frail and bruised with the slightest touch. Each client has their struggles. They aren't creatures of legend. They're people with conditions the world doesn't understand. They're lonely, rejected by families, shunned by society, and labeled as monsters because it's easier than confronting the reality of their suffering. Then there's Hammond, the vampire. His clinical diagnosis would read something like this: erythropoietic protoporphyria, a rare blood disorder that makes sunlight a nightmare, leaving him blistered and burned within minutes. The pale complexion is part of it too, caused by low melanin and poor circulation. He insists he's a predator, but it's really just his body's inability to produce what it needs. He can't eat solid food without vomiting. Blood is his sole source of nutrients. Hammond would often remind me that creatures tend to die when you shove something through their heart or cut their head off. So that bit isn't exclusive to his kind. The first time we met, Hammond had explained his terms clearly. He paid well, tipped better, and required a little extra during our time together. By extra, he meant blood. But he wasn't savage about it. He didn't bite, as you might expect. Instead, he used this ornate little knife, thin and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, to make small cuts. He'd lap the blood directly from the wound, always careful not to take too much. I didn't ask questions. The money was good, and he was predictable in his peculiarities. Supernatural beings tend to have unique tastes, though you might be surprised how mundane some of their desires are. they come to me for more than the usual reasons. Sometimes, I think it's because I don't look at them like monsters. Other times, I wonder if they see me as something less than human myself. My work isn't glamorous, but it's meaningful in its own way. Even the supernatural, especially the supernatural, needs someone to see them for who they truly are. Hammond was one of my regulars. 5 months ago, I almost didn't make it out of one of our nights alive. The first time we met, Hammond explained his terms clearly. He paid well, tipped better, and required a little extra during our time together. By extra, he meant blood, but he wasn't savage about it. He didn't bite as you might expect. Instead, he used an ornate little knife, thin and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, to make small cuts. He'd lap the blood directly from the wound, always careful not to take too much. I didn't ask questions. The money was good, and he was predictable in his peculiarities. That night was supposed to be no different. The room was dimly lit, the air heavy with the smell of leather and the faint residue of incense. I leaned against the desk, wearing his favorite lace slip, waiting for him to finish his usual ritual of brooding. "How long do I have you tonight?" he asked, his voice soft but sharp, like a blade gliding over ice. "As long as you need." I purred, knowing good and well the cash would be there when we were done. The arrangement proceeded as always. Afterward, he reached for the knife and asked, "May I?" I nodded. It was routine by then. He made a small cut on my arm, just above the vein, and pressed his mouth to it, drinking slow and deliberate. I watched him, detached. It wasn't intimate, not really. To him, I was a resource, no different from the glasses of wine I left half drunk on the nightstand. But that night, something changed. Hammond's breathing quickened, and his grip on my arm tightened. The usual precision of his movements gave way to something erratic. I winced as the blade slipped deeper into my skin, pain flaring where there should have been nothing but the sting of a shallow cut. "Hammond," I said, tugging my arm. He didn't respond. His lips moved faster, pulling at the blood with a desperation I'd never seen in him before. His pupils dilated, the dark of his eyes swallowing the amber glow of the room. "Hammond, stop," I said, louder this time. He growled a deep, animalistic sound that made my stomach turn. The knife in his hand trembled as it slipped from the cut on my arm to my shoulder. He pressed harder, and the blade bit into flesh. Pain exploded through me. "Stop," I screamed, shoving at him with everything I had. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. His hunger had taken control, and I was just a bleeding vessel in his grip. He growled again, pinning me against the desk as his lips latched onto the wound, drinking in frantic gulps. I felt my strength draining. The room blurred at the edges, the amber light dimming into shadow. "Please," I whispered, my voice faint. That word, "please," seemed to pierce whatever frenzy had taken hold of him. Hammond froze, his lips still wet with blood, his wide, hungry eyes locking on mine. Slowly he pulled away, staring at the deep gash he'd left, at the blood soaking my slip, at the lifeless way I sagged against the desk. "Lorelei," he murmured, his voice trembling. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The darkness crept over me, and the last thing I saw was his horrified face as he scrambled to stop the bleeding he had caused. I woke up hours later in my own bed. Someone had stitched the wound and left a bottle of pills on the nightstand. No note, no explanation, just a promise that I wouldn't bleed out. I haven't seen Hammond since that night. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about him, the monster he tried so hard to suppress, but ultimately couldn't control. And in the stillness of night, my fingers find the scar on my arm, tracing its path as I wonder if I'll ever trust another vampire to get that close again. But that's enough storytelling for one night. The memories are a little too raw to keep unpacking. And, to be honest, I may have indulged in a glass or three of wine while writing this. Let's just say I'm too tipsy to keep my thoughts straight. My next client is Ulrich, a ridiculously handsome and absurdly hairy German werewolf. I'm sure his story will be quite the tale to tell when I'm sober enough to do it justice. I felt my strength draining away. The room blurred at the edges, the amber light dimming into shadow. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely there. That one word, please, it seemed to cut through whatever frenzy had taken hold of him. Killian froze, his lips still wet with blood, his wide, hungry eyes locking on mine. Slowly he pulled back, staring at the deep gash he'd left, at the blood soaking my slip, at the way I was slumped lifelessly against the desk. "Siren," he murmured, his voice shaking. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The darkness was closing in, and the last thing I saw was his horrified face as he scrambled to stop the bleeding he had caused. I woke up hours later in my own bed. Someone had stitched up the wound and left a bottle of pills on the nightstand. No note, no explanation, just a promise that I wouldn't bleed out. I haven't seen Killian since that night. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about him, the monster he tried so hard to keep in check, but ultimately couldn't control. And in the stillness of the night, my fingers find the scar on my arm, tracing its path as I wonder if I'll ever trust another vampire to get that close again. But that's enough of that for one night. The memories are a little too fresh to keep digging them up. And, to be honest, I might have had a glass or three of wine while writing this. Let's just say I'm too tipsy to keep my thoughts straight. My next client is Klaus, a ridiculously handsome and absurdly hairy German werewolf. I'm sure his story will be quite the tale to tell when I'm sober enough to do it justice. The world went crazy when the pandemic hit. Everyone was freaking out, buying all the toilet paper and canned beans they could get their hands on. But my old man, Frank, he took it to a whole other level. See, Frank was always a bit of a prepper, a tin foil hat kind of guy, as my sister, Sarah, used to say. But this time it was different. He actually had a bunker, a legit underground hideout he'd been working on for years out in the middle of nowhere, near the old Miller farm. When things started getting really hairy with the virus, Frank packed up and vanished into his hole in the ground. He said he was going to stay there until it was safe to come out. We thought he was being a little extra, but hey, it was his life. At first, he called us regularly from the bunker. He had this old satellite phone, a relic from the 90s, that somehow still worked. He'd ramble on about how he had enough food to last a decade and how the government was using the pandemic to control us. Sarah and I would just roll our eyes and let him talk. We figured he'd get bored and come home after a few weeks. Then, about 3 months ago, the calls stopped. Just like that. Poof. No more rambling about conspiracy theories. No more updates on his dwindling supply of baked beans. It was like he'd fallen off the face of the earth, which, technically, he kind of had. Sarah started to get worried first. She's always been the more anxious one. "What if something happened to him, Mark?" she'd say, her voice all shaky. "What if he's sick? What if the bunker ran out of air or water?" I tried to stay calm. "He's probably fine, Sarah," I'd say, though I wasn't so sure myself. "He's got enough supplies down there to survive a nuclear winter. Maybe his phone just died, or he doesn't want to pay for it anymore." But deep down, a knot of worry was starting to form in my stomach, too. 3 months is a long time, even for a hardcore prepper like Frank. We tried calling the satellite phone, of course, but it went straight to voicemail, that same old message of his. "Leave a message after the beep, and maybe, just maybe, I'll call you back when the world isn't ending." It used to be funny. Now, it just felt eerie. Sarah wanted to drive out there right away, but I convinced her to wait. We didn't even know exactly where the bunker was. Just that it was somewhere near the old Miller farm, which is a good hour from the nearest town. Besides, what if we went all the way out there, and he was just sitting in his bunker, refusing to answer the door? We'd look like idiots. But the silence was getting to me too. It was like a heavy blanket, smothering any hope that he was just being his usual eccentric self. We had to do something. We had to know if our dad was okay. We started by trying to find out as much as we could about the bunker and the surrounding area. We had to start somewhere. Sarah and I started our detective work, trying to piece together anything we could about Frank's bunker and his whole prepper lifestyle. It felt weird, digging into his private world like this, but we were desperate. We knew the general area near the old Miller farm, but that was like saying, somewhere in the desert. The Miller farm was huge, and most of it was just abandoned fields and woods. We started with what little we knew about the bunker itself. Sarah remembered Frank bragging about how it was impenetrable and off the grid. He'd once shown us a blurry picture on his phone, something about reinforced steel doors and a ventilation system he was particularly proud of. He was always going on about having his own well and a generator for power, so he wouldn't have to rely on the system, as he called it. Next, we tried to remember anything Frank had said about his supply situation. We knew he was stocked up, but on what exactly? Sarah recalled him talking about having enough canned food to feed a small army, and a water purification system that could turn mud into champagne. I remembered him mentioning medical supplies, a first aid kit, and some kind of radio, probably for listening to emergency broadcasts. The guy was prepared for the apocalypse, that's for sure. Then there was Frank himself. We had to think about his personality, his quirks, his possible weaknesses. He was stubborn as a mule, that's for sure. Once he made up his mind about something, there was no changing it. He was also fiercely independent and distrustful of authority. The pandemic had only amplified those traits. He probably saw himself as some kind of lone wolf, surviving by his wits while the rest of us, sheep, followed the government's orders. We hit a wall pretty quickly. We didn't have much to go on. That's when Sarah suggested we try to find someone who might know more about the area around the Miller farm. Maybe a neighbor, or someone who used to work there, she said. It was a long shot, but we were running out of options. We spent hours online, searching for anyone connected to the Miller farm. We found an old forum post from years ago, mentioning a guy named Jerry who used to do odd jobs around there. It was a shot in the dark, but we managed to track down a phone number. I dialed, my heart pounding in my chest. A gruff voice answered, "Yeah. Hi, is this Jerry?" I asked. "We're looking for information about the old Miller farm. I hesitated, not wanting to reveal too much. "We're looking for someone who might have been out there recently." There was a long pause. "Who's asking?" Jerry said, his voice suspicious. I explained that we were trying to find our father, Frank, who might be living near the farm. I kept it vague, just saying he was a bit of a recluse, and we hadn't heard from him in a while. Another long pause. "Frank, you say, built himself a bunker out there, did he?" My breath caught in my throat. "You know him?" "He know of him," Jerry corrected. "Heard stories. Folks around here called him Bunker Frank. Said he was a bit off. This was it. We were finally getting somewhere." Jerry didn't know exactly where the bunker was, but he confirmed that Frank was definitely out there, somewhere on the old Miller property. He also mentioned that Frank had hired him a few times years ago to help with some construction. He remembered Frank being paranoid about security, always talking about keeping people out. Jerry's call was a breakthrough. We had confirmation that Frank was in the bunker, and we had a name, a label the locals used, Bunker Frank. It wasn't much, but it was more than we had before. It gave us a renewed sense of purpose, a reason to not give up. Now, we just needed to figure out how to actually find the darn thing, his bunker. And, if or when we did, how to get him to open the door. The feeling that we were running out of time grew stronger with every passing hour. Armed with the new information from Jerry, Sarah and I felt a renewed sense of urgency, but also a heavy dose of dread. Bunker Frank, they called him. It sounded ominous, like a character from a post-apocalyptic movie. We knew time was of the essence. We decided to call the local sheriff's office. We explained the situation, the whole story about Frank, the pandemic, the bunker, and the 3 months of silence. The deputy on the phone listened patiently, but he didn't sound too hopeful. He said they'd do a welfare check, but he warned us that if Frank didn't want to be found, there wasn't much they could do. It was his property after all, even if it was just a hole in the ground. Sarah was practically vibrating with anxiety. "We can't just wait around, Mark," she exclaimed. "What if he's hurt? What if he needs us?" I knew she was right. Waiting felt impossible. So, against my better judgment, and probably against the advice of the sheriff's department, we decided to go to the Miller farm ourselves. We packed some supplies, water, food, a first aid kit, and a flashlight, just in case we actually found the bunker and it was dark inside. The drive out there was tense. The closer we got, the more desolate the landscape became. The old Miller farm was even more rundown than I remembered. Fields overgrown with weeds, fences falling apart, and a general air of abandonment hung over the place. We spent hours searching, driving down dirt roads and walking through overgrown fields. We yelled Frank's name until our voices were hoarse, but the only answer was the wind whistling through the tall grass. It felt hopeless. We were looking for a needle in a haystack, a very well hidden, possibly booby-trapped needle. Just as we were about to give up, Sarah spotted something glinting in the sun, hidden behind a thick cluster of trees. It was a metal pipe, sticking out of the ground at an odd angle. It looked like a ventilation shaft. "Mark," she shouted, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and fear. "I think I found it." My heart leaped into my throat. Could it be? We scrambled towards the pipe, our boots sinking into the soft earth. As we got closer, we saw a faint outline in the ground, a rectangular shape covered with dirt and leaves. It was a door, a heavy metal door, just like the one Frank had shown us in that blurry picture. We found the bunker. We cleared away the debris, revealing a rusty padlock securing the door. We called out to Frank, our voices echoing in the stillness. No answer. We tried the padlock, but it was solid. We were so close, yet so far. Suddenly, we heard a muffled voice from inside. It was Frank, his voice weak and raspy. "Dad, it's us, Mark and Sarah." I yelled back, relief flooding through me. There was a long silence, then, "Go away." "Dad, we're worried about you. We haven't heard from you in months," Sarah pleaded. Another silence. Then the sound of metal scraping against metal. The door creaked open, slowly revealing a dark, narrow passage. A figure emerged, silhouetted against the dim light from inside. It was Frank. He looked thinner, paler, his eyes bloodshot, his beard longer and messier than ever before. He looked like a ghost. He stared at us, his expression unreadable. "I told you," he said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't want to be found." It took a lot of talking, a lot of pleading, and a lot of explaining how worried sick we'd been. It was hard to get through to him at first, but we slowly broke down his resistance. He was weak, dehydrated, and clearly not in his right mind. The isolation had taken a toll on him, both physically and mentally. Getting Frank out of the bunker and back to civilization was another ordeal altogether. He was reluctant to leave his safe haven, but we eventually convinced him that he needed help. We got him to a hospital where he could receive medical attention. The road to recovery for Frank will be long. He has a lot to process, a lot to come to terms with. But he's safe now, and that's all that matters. The silence of the bunker is finally broken, replaced by the sounds of a family, reunited, trying to heal. And as for Sarah and me, well, we learned that even the most prepared person can't predict everything. And sometimes, the greatest survival skill of all is simply reaching out for help when you need it. My mom pulled the ripcord on our family life when I was in 6th grade. Not a baby, you know. I was old enough to get what was going on, but young enough for it to mess me up. She moved out to this place way out in the sticks, tucked deep in the woods. You could only get there by this janky dirt road that snaked off the main drag about 2 miles back. It was like she was hiding from the world or something. The whole thing felt like a whirlwind, a total blur. 1 minute everything was normal, the next Mom was gone, starting over. Looking back, I feel like a total jerk for being such a brat about it. I'm realizing now, 8 years later, how rough it had to have been on her. But back then, yeah, it was a shock. Sleeping in a different bed, in a strange house, without my dad around, took some serious getting used to. I was lucky, I guess. I got to see both my parents a lot, splitting my time half and half with each of them. I ended up becoming buddies with these two brothers, Alex and Ben, who lived at the dead end of that dirt road. Alex was the older one, always trying to act tough, but he was a softy deep down. Ben was a year younger than me, a total goofball. They were probably the main reason I didn't completely lose it after my parents split. We were inseparable, spending hours, even whole days, messing around in the woods behind our houses. It was our kingdom, you know. We'd find cool rocks, build crappy forts, try to catch turtles in the swampy areas, you name it. We were living that klitschy kid life, bonding over dumb stuff like wrestling and tearing around on our four-wheelers. Our hangout was this old abandoned quarry, about halfway between our places, hidden deep in the woods. You could only really get to it on these overgrown trails, perfect for ATVs. It had to have been like 100 years since anyone used it for anything legit. We spent so much time there. We'd even bring extra gas cans so we could keep riding after we burned through our tanks, seeing who could catch the most air off the jumps. That quarry was our sandlot, our barrens, our own secret world. So, this one Friday, I'm home from school early. It was late September, early October. Still pretty warm out. The sun was still high, so I figured I'd make the most of it. See, Alex and Ben went to a different school district. I should have been going there too, based on where my mom lived. But since my dad still lived in my old district, it was just easier for me to stay put. Made things less complicated, you know. Anyway, they didn't get home until like an hour and a half after me. Since I was stuck waiting for them, I was left to my own devices. Usually, that meant I'd end up wandering around in the woods behind my house, looking for deer bones or trying to start a fire like some wanted survivalist, which I totally wasn't. I knew like 2 things from Bing, watching those shows. This particular day, I grabbed a big stick, my makeshift machete, and headed into the trees. After maybe 15 minutes, I stumbled onto one of our usual spots, this busted up old mobile home. We were always making up crazy stories about it. Who lived there? How did it even get way out there in the middle of nowhere? There was no real road leading to it. But this time, something was off. As I walked around the back, I saw it, the door was wide open. Now, any sane person would have gone back home, waited for their friends, and then told them about it. But me? Nope. I was a dumb, curious kid. So I went in alone. I poked my head through the doorway. And all those made-up stories were about to get a dose of reality. The kitchen was first. It was filthy, covered in dirt, leaves, and raccoon crap. but it still looked like someone had used it at one time. There was one plate, one fork, one spoon, one knife in the sink. To the right was the living room, if you could even call it that. A stained, ripped up couch faced a huge window that took up almost the whole wall. A single, wobbly nightstand was next to it. That was it. The whole place had this creepy, sad vibe. Then I went into the bedroom, and it felt like someone punched me in the gut. Tied to the bed frame was this thing. It used to be a deer, I think, but it was messed up beyond belief. It was half-skinned, twisted into this sick shape. Its guts were all over the place, spread out on the carcass and spilling onto the floor. The floor was already stained dark red from, well, you know. The deer's head was ripped off, hanging on the wall above the bed, its black eyes staring right through me. The wall was covered in bloody streaks and deep claw marks. I froze. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to make some kind of noise, but nothing came out. I was locked in a staring contest with those dead eyes. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't work. I was just shaking, and the silence of the woods was deafening. Then this shriek, this unholy scream, echoed through the trees. It was the sound of pure terror, like everything I'd ever been afraid of rolled into one. My hair stood on end. Whatever made that sound, it snapped me out of my trance. I bolted for the door. Home. I had to get home. Mom would be there. She'd know what to do. I'd be safe. I burst through the doorway, but as I took the first step down, something made me stop. Something made me look, and there it was. About 500 feet back in the trees, hunched over, leaning against a tree, was something unreal. It wasn't black, exactly, more like it sucked all the light out of the air around it. It was shaped like a man, but all wrong. Its arms and legs were too long and bent at these impossible angles. But the face of that's what still haunts me. It was just blank, flat, except for this huge, gaping mouth. Its neck was twitching, spasming, its head shaking like crazy. Any normal person's neck would have snapped, but not this thing. Then, it opened its mouth, that gaping hole, and let out another one of those shrieks. As it screamed, its head whipped around, sending the sound in every direction. Then, it lunged, sprinting at me, still convulsing. Every cell in my body screamed at me to run, to move, to do something, but again I was frozen. I gasped. A deep, shuddering breath finally kick-started my body. I turned and ran faster than I ever had in my life. Trees blurred past me. That thing was right behind me, its scream echoing in my ears. I could feel its breath on my neck, but it never quite caught me. It was playing with me, like a cat with a mouse. It wanted me alive on that bed, like the deer. I was running blind, my legs burning, when suddenly my foot caught on something, a log buried under the leaves. I went down hard. I looked up, and through my blurry vision I saw it. The monster stood over me, shaking, screaming. All I could do was turn my head away, close my eyes, and wait for it to end. But then, through the roaring in my ears, I heard another sound: engines. 2 four-wheelers. I turned back toward the monster, and it was gone, vanished, like it was never there. I lay there in the leaves, paralyzed, the fear still crushing me. Alex and Ben found me a few minutes later. I guess I'd screamed louder than I thought. They gave me a ride back to my house. My ankle was throbbing. I'd twisted it when I fell. After getting an earful from my mom about not going into the woods alone, we just hung out inside until it was time for them to head home and for me to go to bed. Later that night, I woke up in a cold sweat, my throat dry. I hobbled to the kitchen to get a glass of water, and that's when I made the mistake of looking out the window. There it was, on the other side of the fence, shaking in the moonlight, staring right at me. I blinked, and it was gone. After that night, things got weird, really weird. My mom started dating this new guy, John, and not long after, she decided to move in with him. I guess she figured a change of scenery would be good for us, especially after, the thing in the woods. I tried to tell myself that it was for the best. Maybe getting away from that place would help me forget about it. But that blood-curdling shriek was still echoing in my head, like a bad song stuck on repeat. John's place was closer to town, less isolated, which was supposed to be a good thing. But I still felt uneasy. I kept expecting to see that thing, lurking around every corner, hiding in every shadow. I even started having nightmares, the same one over and over. I'd be back in that trailer, strapped to that bed, and that creature would be standing over me, its gaping mouth opening in that silent scream. School was no escape, either. I couldn't focus in class. I was jumpy, constantly looking over my shoulder. Alex and Ben tried to help, but how could they understand? They hadn't seen what I saw. They hadn't felt that icy terror grip their heart. I started spending more and more time alone, lost in my own thoughts, haunted by the memory of those empty eyes staring down at me from the wall. One evening, a few weeks after we moved, I was taking out the trash. It was getting dark, the streetlights flickering on one by one. As I walked back toward the house, I glanced at the neighbor's yard, and my blood ran cold. Standing at the edge of the property, partially hidden by a thick hedge, was that silhouette. It was just standing there, motionless, but I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was just like before, in the woods. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was paralyzed. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that when I opened them, it would be gone. When I finally dared to look again, it was still there. But this time, it was closer. It had moved from the neighbor's yard to the edge of our driveway. I could see the faint outline of its body in the dim light, the unnatural angles of its limbs. I could almost make out that gaping mouth, a black void in the gathering darkness. Panic seized me. I stumbled backward, tripping over the curb and falling hard onto the pavement. I scrambled to my feet and ran into the house, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, my body shaking uncontrollably. "What's wrong with you?" my mom asked, coming out of the kitchen. She looked concerned, but how could I explain what I'd seen? How could I make her understand? "Nothing," I mumbled, trying to catch my breath. "Just tripped." She gave me a skeptical look but didn't press the issue. I spent the rest of the evening in my room, the curtains drawn tight, the lights blazing. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside my window, sent shivers down my spine. I knew somehow that it was out there, watching me, waiting. A few days later, I decided to try to move on with my life and forget the encounter in the woods. I can't let this control me anymore. I decided to walk to the local store to buy some candy. It was the afternoon, so I wasn't too worried. That thing like the night, I was almost certain of that. As I made my way through the candy aisle, my phone buzzed. It was my mom calling. Can you grab me a few things while you are there?" she asked. "Sure, what do you need?" I replied. We talked for a few minutes as I grabbed what she needed. As we hung up, I made my way to the checkout counter. As I walked outside, I saw it again. It was standing across the street, just standing there, in broad daylight. My heart sank. How could this be possible? People walked by, not even noticing it. Didn't they see it? How could they not? It was looking right at me, that blank face somehow more terrifying than any monster mask. I felt that familiar wave of fear wash over me, but this time, something else mixed with it. Anger. I was tired of being afraid, tired of running, tired of this thing haunting me. I took a deep breath and started walking towards it, my fists clenched at my sides. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I couldn't just stand there and let it win. As I got closer, the creature started to shake, its head twitching violently. That shriek filled the air, but this time it didn't paralyze me. It fueled my anger. I kept walking, my eyes locked on that empty face. "What do you want from me?" I yelled, my voice trembling but firm. The creature didn't answer. It just kept shaking, its shrieks growing louder, more intense. People on the street were starting to stare now, not at the creature but at me. I must have looked crazy yelling at thin air. But I didn't care. Suddenly, the creature stopped shaking. It tilted its head, as if considering my question. Then it opened its mouth wide, wider than I thought possible, and let out a shriek so loud, so piercing, that I thought my eardrums would burst. I covered my ears, but the sound still penetrated my skull, vibrating in my bones. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. The creature stood there for a moment, its chest heaving, then it turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I stood there stunned, my ears ringing, my body shaking. It was gone. Again. But this time something was different. I didn't feel that same sense of dread, that overwhelming fear. I felt empty, drained. I never saw the creature again after that day. But I never forgot it, either. I moved away, went to college, got a job. I tried to live a normal life, but the memory of that thing, that shriek, still lingered in the back of my mind. I eventually moved to the city, hoping that the hustle and bustle, the constant noise and activity, would drown out the silence where that creature's shriek still echoed. It helped a little. But sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet, I think I can still hear it, that blood-curdling scream, a reminder of the thing in the woods, the thing that followed me, the thing that may still be out there, somewhere, waiting. And I pray that no one else ever has to hear that scream, that awful, haunting sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Because once you hear it, you can never truly escape it. It stays with you, buried deep inside, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks just beyond the edges of our world. And you can never be sure if it's truly gone or just waiting. Waiting in the silence, waiting in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return and claim its next victim. You just pray it never comes back. Back in high school, me and my crew were super into spooky stuff. It was our thing, you know. We started out messing with an Ouija board in some cemetery at night, and like addicts looking for a bigger high, we moved on to exploring abandoned buildings that were supposed to be haunted. Except for the seriously creepy vibes in most of those places, we never got into any real danger. That is, until our last adventure. It had been a while since we had the chance to go on any adventure. Once we graduated high school, some of us moved away for college, others started families, and others simply fell off the face of the earth. Then, out of the blue, I got a call from my best friend from high school, Jake. After catching up, he throws this idea at me, a trip to a national park. Now, usually, this kind of trip would actually be a nice outdoor experience, but Jake picked this particular park for a reason: the crazy number of people who go missing there every year. This little detail immediately gave me pause. We were all adrenaline junkies in a way, always chasing that next scare. But this was different. We weren't going to explore some abandoned building or play ghost in a graveyard. We were talking about a place where real people go missing and are never heard from again. But Jake, being the smooth talker he is, managed to convince me that we'd be safe just camping in the park, and that a few guys in our group had tons of experience in the wilderness. Even though I should have made the same decision, hung up the phone, and gone back to my boring life. 2 days later, I was on the road, meeting up with my friends at the park's visitor center. First thing I noticed, this place was gorgeous. We hadn't even begun to explore, and it was already one of the most breathtaking places I'd ever seen. Second thing I noticed, the bulletin board by the parking lot. It was plastered with missing person posters. While we were unloading all our camping gear, a park ranger came out of the visitor center. He looked dead tired, like he hadn't slept in a week, but he was trying hard to fake a friendly smile. "Hello everyone, what brings you to our park?" he asked, his voice flat and weary. Jake, ever the charmer, started up a conversation. "We're just here for a camping weekend, Sir Bar." The ranger's face fell when he heard that. "Yeah, figures. Look, you folks don't look like the clueless type, and I know you saw the bulletin board. People tend to go missing in this park, and we're super short-staffed. I'm the only one on shift right now. If you insist on camping here, don't go too deep into the woods and stay on the marked trails. If you get lost out here, well, we don't have a good track record of finding folks." The ranger didn't stick around for our reply. He just went about his day, and we went about ours. Our group, 6 of us in total. 3 guys, me, Jake, and Ben, and 3 girls, Lily, Sarah, and Anna, hiked for a few miles, looking for a decent camping spot in the woods. I was initially against being so far from our cars until Jake and Ben pulled out hunting rifles from their bags. If there was anything dangerous in these woods, I figured we'd be okay. After a long walk, we found the perfect spot and started setting up our tents. By nightfall, we had a bunch of tents around a campfire, and we cracked open a few beers and started reminiscing about our old high school adventures. Around midnight, Jake had a terrible idea that he excitedly pitched to the rest of us. We should try and find some of those missing people out here. Some of them would just be bones by now. Nobody was drunk enough to go traipsing through the dark woods looking for ghosts, except for Jake, Ben, and Anna, Jake's girlfriend. When the rest of us inevitably shot down his proposal, he grabbed his rifle and Ben and Anna, and they drunkenly set off for a spooky adventure in the woods. As they left, and we could no longer hear their steps in the woods, I remembered the ranger's warning, stay on the marked trails, which they definitely weren't doing. My worries were validated hours later, when they still hadn't returned. We tried calling their phones, but there was no service this deep in the woods. After some debate, we decided to head back to the visitor center and get help from the ranger. Even with his earlier warnings, it was a better bet than stumbling around in the dark and getting lost ourselves. We grabbed what we needed, flashlights and the other rifle Ben had left behind, and started back. About 30 minutes in, we noticed something unsettling. All the wildlife around us went dead quiet. It felt like our footsteps were echoing through the woods for miles. From my very limited experience in nature, I remembered that when the woods went silent, a predator was nearby. Just as that thought crossed my mind, a scream shattered the silence. Help! It sounded like Jake, somewhere not too far from us. Help me! We started following the screams, which led us further and further off the trail. A few dozen feet deeper into the woods, we found a flickering flashlight, cracked and barely working. A few feet in front of us, we heard, Jake, again, help me. This time, Jake's voice sounded weaker, but something was off. The voice sounded wrong, like someone was trying to imitate a human voice and Jake's at the same time. Jake, are you hurt, buddy? I asked, concerned, but not moving an inch closer until I got a reply. Yes. Come, help, Jake said, maybe 20 feet in front of us. He seemed to be on his knees. Where are Ben and Anna? I asked, signaling to Lily to ready the rifle she was carrying. Here. We, phone D. I pointed my flashlight at Jake. His body was on its knees, his head slumped forward, and his shirt was covered in dirt and soaked in blood. I knew then that whatever was talking to us, just a few feet away, wasn't Jake. He had been dead for hours. They were so damn tasty. The voice stopped trying to imitate Jake. Jake's head lifted, and we could see his lifeless eyes rolled back in his head, and somehow his dislocated jaw was moving on its own, like some kind of demonic ventriloquist act. Something huge and grotesque emerged from behind Jake's corpse. It had one of its inhuman hands lodged into the back of Jake's skull, using him like a puppet. It didn't waste any time, dropping to all fours and rushing towards us. Lily fired a shot and missed. Before we could even react, it slammed into us, throwing me and Sarah in different directions, but making a beeline for Lily first, since she had the gun. I landed a few feet from Sarah, who had landed badly and broken her leg. I got her up, and we shuffled as fast as Sarah could manage, while the creature ripped chunks off Lily. We made it maybe 50 meters before we were knocked to the ground, and Sarah was dragged off into the dark woods, screaming all the way. I scrambled to my feet and sprinted faster and further than I ever had before. I stopped hearing Sarah's screams and knew that thing would catch up to me any second, no matter how fast the adrenaline was pumping. I fell in the darkness, falling for longer than I should have. There must have been some kind of cliff I didn't see. I landed on something hard and soft at the same time. I couldn't see a thing after dropping my flashlight. I could only smell the terrible, putrid stench of death all around me. I could hear dozens of flies buzzing around, and it made me freeze in terror. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see the hundreds of bodies around me. I had fallen into a mass grave. None of the corpses were complete, from what I could tell, and some of them I recognized. Anna and Ben were among the piles of the dead, and one particular body I could recognize as the park ranger we had met that morning. I had to swallow back a scream as a couple more bodies were thrown into the pile. The creature was actively searching the pile for any sign of me. I had to play dead until the creature left, defeated. I waited for what felt like an eternity until the first rays of light broke through the trees. I felt sick to my stomach as I tried crawling over the dead bodies and out of the pit. I cried for my friends and cried some more when my foot got stuck in one of the bodies. It was Jake, and my foot had gone through where his stomach used to be. Eventually, I crawled out of the mass grave and found my way back to the path we had originally taken. A few hours of walking, and I reached the visitor center where our cars were waiting. I got into my car and just sat there, catatonic, for a few minutes. After I snapped out of it, I drove away, the feeling of still being watched too overwhelming. As I did, I saw a car heading towards the visitor center. A man, a woman, and two young kids in the back seat. I wish I could say I stopped and warned them about the impending doom that awaited them. But I just drove. I didn't look back. After driving for hours, I finally pulled over at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. I was still shaking, covered in dirt, and probably looked like I'd crawled out of a grave, which, I kind of had. I went inside, grabbed a bottle of water, and tried to wash the grime off my face in the grimy bathroom. The guy at the counter, probably used to seeing all sorts of weirdos, just gave me a nod and went back to reading his newspaper. Back in my car, I tried to process what had happened. It all felt like a nightmare, a really messed up, incredibly vivid nightmare. My friends, people I'd known since we were kids, were gone, devoured by some thing in the woods, and that thing was still out there. I knew I had to report this, but who would believe me? I sounded crazy just thinking about it. A monster in the woods, a mass grave. I'd be locked up in a psych ward, not taken seriously. But I couldn't just do nothing. The thought of that family driving into the park, completely unaware of the horror that awaited them, was eating me up inside. I decided to call the police, a different precinct, not the local one near the park. I figured maybe a fresh set of ears would give my story at least some merit. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. When the operator answered, I started from the beginning, trying to sound as rational as possible, despite the insane story I was telling. I told them about the missing persons, the ranger's warning, Jake's stupid idea, the creature, the mass grave. everything. The operator listened patiently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I was finished, there was a long silence on the other end. "Sir," she finally said, her voice laced with skepticism, "I understand you've been through a traumatic experience, but what you're describing, it's just not possible. There's no record of any creature like that in the area, and the National Park Service takes missing person reports very seriously. But I saw it," I insisted, my voice cracking. "I saw it with my own eyes. My friends are dead. Sir, I'm going to recommend that you seek some counseling. You've clearly been through something very difficult. In the meantime, I'll pass this information on to the park authorities, but I can't guarantee they'll be able to do anything." Based on this account, I knew she didn't believe me. I hung up, feeling defeated and more alone than ever. I was stranded, covered in the evidence of a massacre that nobody would believe happened. My phone was dead, and all I wanted to do was go home, but home was hours away. I decided that the first thing I had to do was to get a charger for my cell phone. I would figure out what to do once it was charged. I went back into the store to buy a charger, hoping they had one that would fit my phone. The guy behind the counter gave me a wary look as I approached. I guess I had not made a very good first impression. "I need to buy a charger for my phone," I said while gesturing with my dead phone in hand. The guy behind the counter gave me a nod and asked what model phone I had. I told him, and he went searching through a drawer. Finally, he pulled out a charger that would fit and put it on the counter. I started searching through my pockets when I realized I didn't have any money. It must have fallen when I fell into the pit. "Sir, are you going to buy the charger?" asked the clerk with a slight tone of impatience. "I left my wallet in the woods. I have no money," I replied, not knowing what else to say. "So you are telling me you can't pay for the charger? Do you expect me to just give it to you?" "Get out of my store, you hobo," said the clerk, clearly annoyed. I felt defeated. There was nothing else I could do. So I left the store and started walking down the road. I didn't know where I was going, but staying seemed pointless, and I hoped someone would eventually stop and pick me up. Hours passed and the sun started to set. I was exhausted, I was hungry, and I felt like giving up. That's when I saw them. Headlights coming from behind me on the road. I turned, waving my arms frantically, hoping they would see me. The car, a beat-up old pickup truck, slowed down and pulled over beside me. The driver, an old, grizzled man with a kind face, rolled down his window. "You all right there, son?" he asked, his voice raspy but gentle. "You look like you've been through hell." I need help," I stammered, tears welling up in my eyes again. "My friends, they're gone. There's something in the woods." The old man listened patiently as I, once again, recounted the whole story. I expected him to laugh, to tell me I was crazy, to drive off and leave me there. But he didn't. When I was finished, he just nodded slowly. "I believe you, son," he said, his voice firm. "I've lived in these parts all my life, and I've heard stories. Stories about things in those woods. Things people don't talk about." He opened the passenger door. "Get in," he said. "I'll take you to my place. You can get cleaned up, get some food, and we'll figure out what to do next. I climbed into the truck, a sliver of hope flickering in my chest for the first time since that night. As we drove off into the darkness, I knew one thing for sure. My ordeal was far from over. But maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I thought I was. The old man, who introduced himself as Jedediah, lived in a small cabin a few miles from the gas station. It was simple but cozy, and the smell of wood smoke and coffee filled the air. Jedediah gave me some clean clothes, an old flannel shirt and a pair of jeans that were a bit too big, and let me use his shower. The hot water felt amazing on my aching muscles, and I scrubbed myself raw, trying to wash away the grime and the memory of the horrors I'd seen. After I was cleaned up, Jedediah made us some food, a simple stew that tasted like heaven after the ordeal I'd been through. As we ate, he told me more about the stories he'd heard. Stories of people disappearing in the woods, of strange lights and sounds, of whispers in the dark. Stories that the local authorities dismissed as folklore and old wives' tales. They don't want to believe it, Jedediah said, his eyes dark with a knowing sadness. They don't want to scare away the tourists. But it's real, son. I've seen things I can't explain. He told me about a creature the old-timers called the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit that haunted the woods, preying on the lost and the weak. It could mimic human voices, lure people to their deaths, and possessed an insatiable hunger for human flesh. The more he talked, the more the pieces started to fall into place. The creature I'd encountered, its ability to mimic Jake's voice, its monstrous appearance, it all fit the description of the Wendigo. What do we do? I asked, fear creeping back into my voice. We can't just let it keep killing people. Jedediah sighed. There are old ways, he said, ways to fight these things. But it's dangerous, very dangerous. He told me about rituals, about specific plants and herbs that could ward off the creature, about the importance of fire and iron. It sounded like something out of a fantasy novel, but after what I'd seen, I was willing to believe anything. We spent the next few days preparing. Jedediah, it turned out, was a wealth of knowledge when it came to the old ways. He showed me how to identify the plants we needed, how to prepare them, how to use them in a ritual. We gathered supplies, sharpened tools, and practiced what we would do. I was scared, terrified even, but I knew we had to go back. We had to stop the Wendigo, not just for the sake of my friends, but for all the other people who might wander into its path. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only choice we had. And so, armed with Jedediah's knowledge and a newfound determination, we set off back into the woods, back to the heart of darkness, to face the monster that had taken everything from me. The hunt was on. The journey back to the park was tense. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent shivers down my spine. Jedediah, though calm and focused, radiated a quiet intensity that told me he was just as aware of the danger we were walking into. We were no longer hikers, we were hunters, tracking a prey far more dangerous than any animal. We reached the outskirts of the park as dusk began to settle. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to deepen, twisting familiar shapes into monstrous figures. We avoided the main trails, sticking to the overgrown paths, that Jedediah seemed to know like the back of his hand. He moved with a surprising agility for a man his age, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. As darkness fully enveloped us, we reached the area where my friends had met their gruesome end. The memory of that night flooded back, vivid and raw. I could almost hear their screams, see the creature's grotesque form in the darkness, but I pushed the fear down. Fear was a luxury we couldn't afford. Jedediah led me to the edge of the mass grave. The stench of decay was overwhelming, a sickening reminder of the creature's brutality. "This is where we make our stand," he said, his voice low and resolute. "This is where it will come." We set to work, preparing the ritual. Jedediah had explained it to me in detail, a complex series of actions and incantations designed to weaken the Wendigo and banish it back to the spirit world from which it came. We laid out a circle of stones, each one carefully chosen and placed according to Jedediah's instructions. Inside the circle, we built a fire, feeding it with specific herbs and woods that Jedediah had gathered. The flames leaped high, casting an eerie glow on the surrounding trees, the smoke carrying a pungent, almost medicinal smell. Jedediah handed me a piece of sharpened iron. "Keep this close," he said. "Iron weakens it. If it gets too close, use it." We stood inside the circle, the fire our only source of light, and waited. The silence of the woods pressed in on us, heavy and expectant. Then we heard it. A low growl, guttural and menacing, echoed through the trees. It was coming. The growl grew louder, closer, followed by the snapping of branches and the thud of heavy footsteps. Then it emerged from the darkness, its eyes glowing with an infernal light. It was even more terrifying than I remembered. Taller than any man, its body emaciated yet powerful, its limbs long and distorted, ending in wickedly sharp claws. Its face was a skull, like mask of horror, with empty eye sockets and a gaping maw filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. The Wendigo stopped at the edge of the circle, its eyes fixed on us. It snarled, a sound that seemed to rip through the very fabric of the night. It tested the boundaries of the circle, pacing back and forth, looking for a way in. Jedediah began to chant, his voice strong and clear, the ancient words echoing through the woods. The fire flared brighter, the smoke swirling around us like a protective shield. The Wendigo hissed, recoiling from the flames. The chanting continued, and the creature grew more agitated. It lunged at the circle, testing its strength, but the stones held. It was trapped for now. As Jedediah's chanting reached a crescendo, I saw my chance. While the creature focused on him, I lunged forward and plunged the iron stake into its leg. The Wendigo shrieked, a sound of pure agony and rage. Black ichor oozed from the wound, sizzling as it touched the ground. The creature stumbled back, its eyes burning with hatred. It was hurt, but far from defeated. It let out another deafening roar and charged again, this time with even greater ferocity. It slammed against the circle, and one of the stones skittered away, breaking the protective barrier. The Wendigo lunged through the gap, its claws reaching for me. I dodged, barely avoiding its grasp, and scrambled back, my heart pounding in my chest. Jedediah, his chanting interrupted, grabbed a burning brand from the fire and thrust it at the creature's face. The Wendigo recoiled, hissing and spitting, but it didn't retreat. It was enraged, its focus now split between the two of us. It swiped at Jedediah, knocking the brand from his hand and sending him sprawling to the ground. "Get up, boy," Jedediah yelled while trying to get back to his feet. "We must finish the ritual." I saw my chance. With the iron stake in hand, I run toward the Wendigo and jump on its back. I plunge the stake deep into its back, right between its shoulder blades. The Wendigo bucked and roared, trying to shake me off, but I held on tight, driving the iron deeper. It was like trying to hold on to a raging bull. Its movements were erratic and incredibly strong. Black blood sprayed everywhere, covering me in its foul-smelling ichor. The creature stumbled, its movements becoming weaker. Jedediah, back on his feet, resumed the chant, his voice hoarse but determined. The fire, as if responding to his call, flared even brighter, the flames reaching towards the sky. I knew this was our last stand, so I held on tighter and pushed the iron stake deeper with all my might. With a final, agonizing shriek, the Wendigo collapsed, its body convulsing violently. The iron stake had pierced something vital. The light in its eyes flickered and died. The creature lay still, its body slowly dissolving into a black, viscous puddle that seeped into the earth, leaving behind only the stench of decay and the lingering echo of its terrifying roar. Silence descended upon the woods, broken only by the crackling of the fire. We had done it. We had defeated the Wendigo. Exhausted and covered in the creature's full ichor, I looked at Jedediah. He was leaning heavily on his staff, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes were filled with a quiet satisfaction. We stood there for a long moment, the weight of what we had done finally sinking in. We had faced a monster, a creature of nightmare, and we had survived. As the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, we gathered what remained of our supplies and left the cursed place behind. We didn't speak much on the journey back. There was no need for words. We had shared an experience that had changed us both forever. I never went back to that national park, and I never saw Jedediah again after he dropped me off at the nearest town. But I never forgot him, or the lessons he taught me, and I never forgot the creature we had faced, the Wendigo, a terrifying reminder of the darkness that lurks just beyond the edges of our civilized world. Sometimes, when the wind howls at night and the shadows dance in the corners of my vision, I remember the woods, the mass grave, and the chilling roar of the Wendigo. And I know that the world is a far more mysterious and dangerous place than most people could ever imagine. But I also know that even in the face of unimaginable horror, courage and the bonds of friendship can prevail. And sometimes that's enough. It has to be. "Wake up, sleepyhead. It's 7:30 p.m. already." Ethan's voice cut through the haze as he shook me not so gently. "Ha." I mumbled, my head throbbing. "Dude, why are you sleeping against the wall? You look like you got hit by a truck. What the hell were you up to last night?" My eyes blinked open, the room slowly coming into focus. It was not my bedroom. My brain scrambled for an excuse. Last night's symphony of moans and bed creaks from the room next door was not something I was ready to share. "New place, you know. Took a walk, got lost, crashed here," I mumbled, hoping it sounded plausible. right? He didn't sound convinced. Anyway, shower's free. We're hitting the breakfast buffet downstairs, and then the museum at 10. I pushed myself upright, every muscle protesting. Stumbling towards the bathroom, I splashed water on my face and peered into the mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of movement behind me, a dark shape in the periphery. My eyes were stinging from the water, so I rubbed them hard. When I looked back, it was gone. What the? I muttered, a shiver crawling down my spine. I grabbed my shampoo and a change of clothes from my duffel bag, trying to shake off the weird feeling. The shower helped, at least, and I made sure to scrub away any lingering weirdness, hoping I smelled at least halfway decent. After I finished, I headed downstairs, my backpack slung over one shoulder. As soon as I hit the kitchen, I heard, "You little pervert." I thought Ben's words were aimed at me. What? Turns out, he was glaring at Alex. "What were you doing lurking outside my room last night, huh?" Ben's voice was rising with every word. "I don't know what you're talking about," Alex responded, sounding genuinely confused. "Oh, you don't? Then explain why you were creeping around at 1:30 in the damn morning." Ben was practically shouting now. "What? Dude, I was asleep. I didn't move an inch the whole night." Alex looked terrified, like a deer in headlights. 1:30? That was 30 minutes before I started to fall asleep again, after I woke up from the noise coming from the room next to us. "Yeah. Then how come I saw you through the peephole? Standing there like a statue, staring right at it." Ben was practically spitting with rage. It sounded freaky as hell, but I couldn't picture Alex doing something like that. He was a meek guy. Alex was stammering, unable to form a coherent sentence. "That's enough," a new voice interjected. It was Michael stepping in to defuse the situation. I was still up at 1:30. Trust me, he was in his bed, out like a light. Michael's tone was calm but firm. He had dark circles under his eyes. Probably didn't sleep well either. "Fine," Ben grumbled, backing down but still shooting daggers at Alex. "You're off the hook this time. But if I catch you creeping around my room again, I'll knock you into next week." He jabbed a finger in Alex's direction for emphasis. All of this drama was unfolding while the trio of girls, Chloe, Sarah, and Olivia, were huddled at their table, glued to their phones, probably posting about their glamorous vacation. Finally, Miss Sarah and Tiffany, who I guessed was her daughter, came down the stairs. "All right, everyone," Miss Sarah announced, clapping her hands together. "How about some bacon and eggs? I'm making breakfast for all of us." Nobody argued. Miss Sarah was technically married, but she was the one who worked, not her husband. I'd heard he was in some kind of accident years ago and couldn't walk anymore. She had to be one tough lady to handle all that. "All right, food's up." Everyone dug in, and before I knew it, we were heading out the door, on our way to the museum. Alex seemed more excited than anyone else about the museum trip. As we stepped outside, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. There was no house across the street from the hotel, just a dense, dark forest. "This fog is seriously cramping my style," Chloe complained, pulling a face. "Chill, girl," Sarah retorted, jumping in. "At least we're free from the parentals for a while, right?" "True," Chloe conceded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Anyway, what were you lovebirds up to last night? Spill it." She looked over at Olivia and winked. "Well, last night," Olivia began, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "I really didn't need the details, so I picked up my pace, moving ahead of them. But then, 100 a.m. Chloe's shriek cut through the air like a knife. Olivia clamped a hand over her mouth, but it was too late. I knew exactly what that time meant. My sleep had been shattered around then by the sounds coming from their room. "What'd you bring, Noah?" Ethan's voice pulled me back to the present. He was walking beside me now. "Snacks and drinks," I replied, patting my backpack. "Figured we might need some fuel after staring at all that old stuff in the museum." We walked for a long time, the fog swirling around us like a living thing. I didn't see anyone, not a single soul, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch. Finally, the museum loomed into view, a massive stone building with 2 imposing doors at the entrance. We filed inside, the cavernous space illuminated by rows of bright lights overhead. A sign on the wall pointed left, towards statues, and right, towards paintings. "Okay, here's the plan," Miss Sarah said, her voice echoing in the vast hall. "We'll split into 2 groups and take turns in each section. Noah, Ethan, Michael, Olivia, and Ben. Why don't you guys tackle the paintings first? The rest of us will check out the statues." "Sound good," Miss Sarah proposed. My name is No. We just nodded. Nobody really cared about the museum except Alex. We wandered through the painting section, and honestly, I found myself getting more into it than I expected. I stopped in front of a painting called "The Sin." It showed a person being burned alive while a crowd watched, their faces twisted in a mix of horror and was that satisfaction. It sent a chill down my spine. As I leaned in closer, the figures in the painting seemed to shift. Their heads turned, their eyes locking with mine. My heart leaped into my throat, and I froze, unable to speak or move. "Hey, you coming?" Michael's voice broke the spell. Ethan was standing next to him, both of them looking back at me. It looked like the lovebirds were already ahead of them. "UIE, yeah, coming," I stammered, but before I could even take a step, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the air. "AHHHHHHA." It came from the other section, the statues. We took off running, our footsteps echoing in the silence. We burst into the statue room and found Alex on the floor, staring up at the statue of Abraham Lincoln, who was standing there, tall and imposing, with his cane in one hand. "What happened?" "Ms. Sarah rushed over to him. Chloe, Sarah, and Tiffany closed behind. Alex, trembling, pointed a shaky finger at the statue. "Why?" It just turned its head and looked at me. I stared at the statue. Its head was definitely turned to the side, looking towards the entrance of the room. On the floor, I spotted a notepad and a pencil, probably Alex's, dropped in his fright. He must have been so engrossed in his research that he didn't notice everyone else had moved on. "That's it," Ms. Sarah declared, her voice tight with concern. "I think we're heading back to the hotel now." As we filed out of the room, I couldn't resist one last look back at the entrance of the statue section. For a split second, I saw it, a figure, peering out from the shadows, watching us leave. Then, just as quickly, It darted back into the darkness. My blood ran cold. A shiver snaked its way down my spine, and I practically bolted out of the museum, stuffing myself in the middle of the group, trying to feel safe, I guess. The whole walk back, Alex was shaking like a leaf. I probably would have been too if Ethan hadn't struck up a conversation. "You think he really saw that?" Ethan asked, his voice low. I, I don't know," I admitted. "I'm not big on the whole ghost thing, but this place, it's giving me the creeps. Big time. What about you?" "Okay, I might sound crazy here," he began, leaning in conspiratorially. "But I think he did. Don't say anything, just listen. Last night, I was still awake when you got up and opened the curtains, remember? When you did that, I swear I saw something in the corner of the room. It was gone in a flash, and I told myself I was just seeing things. Seriously. Dude, I've been seeing weird stuff too. When we first got here, I could have sworn there was a building across the street. And you vanished for a few seconds right in front of my eyes earlier." It seemed like Ethan also saw things like me. He just listened silently and nodded. We finally made it back to the hotel, a heavy silence hanging over the group. Michael and Alex disappeared into their rooms. We also went back into our room. Sighing, I tossed my backpack onto the bed. "So much for snacks," I muttered, checking my bag. Still crammed full of goodies. "Why don't you go door to door? Offer them to everyone. Listen to the room next to us." He pointed to the wall that separates our room from the room next door. "Yeah, I'm glad we bailed early. It was so boring." "I know, right? As long as you're with me, nothing is boring." It was so cheesy. I almost choked trying not to laugh out loud. It sounded like the Hoot girls and Ben had a little party going on in his room. Might as well start there. I grabbed a few bags of chips and a couple of sodas and headed out. I knocked on their door, and Ben swung it open. "He got some extra snacks," I offered. "Figured you guys might want some." He turned around, had a quick, silent conference with the girls, and then took 4 bags of chips and 2 large bottles of soda. Next, I headed to Michael and Alex's room. "We'll send you home tomorrow, okay?" It was Ms. Sarah's voice. What was she doing in their room? I knocked, and Michael opened the door. I could see Ms. Sarah inside, talking to Alex, who looked pale and shaken. You guys want some snacks?" I asked, feeling a bit awkward. Michael turned to Ms. Sarah, asking if she wanted any. She shook her head. He then took 1 bag of chips, probably for Alex, and that was it. Finally, I gave Chloe a bag of chips and a small soda. By now, it was lunchtime, and nobody felt like cooking. I went back to my room to see if Ethan wanted to join me in the kitchen. He said he wasn't hungry. I, on the other hand, was starving. No way was I waiting for Ms. Sarah to whip something up. So, I headed downstairs and decided to make some instant noodles. There weren't any in the kitchen, so I ventured into the storage room. As I rummaged around, I accidentally knocked over a box of lettuce. A few heads rolled out, and something else tumbled out with them. It was a crumpled piece of paper. I unfolded it, my curiosity piqued. The Underground Archive. This is the confirmation paper that the supply has been delivered by our deliverer, Max. Sign below to confirm. There was no signature. The paper was still here, so where was this Max guy? And what the heck was the underground archive? The name sent a shiver down my spine. It sounded seriously shady. I stuffed the note into my pocket and finally located a cup of instant noodles. After lunch, the rest of the day passed uneventfully. But when night fell, sleep evaded me. The image of that statue, its head turning, kept replaying in my mind. I was thirsty, so I got up and quietly opened my door, stepping out into the dark hallway. The whole floor was silent. As I reached the stairs, I saw someone standing at the other end of the hall. It looked like Alex. Alex, I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. You all will never leave this place alive. His voice was different, deeper, and filled with a chilling malice that sent a jolt of fear through me. It was so unlike him that I just stood there, frozen in place. He started to walk away, disappearing into the shadows. I ran to Michael's room and pounded on the door. He finally opened it, looking groggy and confused. But there, in one of the beds, was Alex, sleeping peacefully. You need something? Michael asked, his voice thick with sleep. I couldn't process what I had just seen. He placed his hands on my shoulders, shaking me gently. Oh, sorry, I mumbled, feeling like an idiot. Must have been sleepwalking or something. It was a lame excuse, but I felt bad for waking him. It's all right, he said, yawning. Just get some rest. It's like 1 a.m. He closed the door softly. Was my mind playing tricks on me? What the hell was going on? I stumbled back to my room, my heart hammering against my ribs. What had I just witnessed? Was that really Alex? Or was the lack of sleep and the creepy atmosphere finally getting to me? I crawled back into bed, but sleep was a distant dream. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside the window, sent jolts of fear through me. The image of that figure in the hallway, the chilling words, "You all will never leave this place alive," echoed in my mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first rays of dawn crept through the curtains. I got up, feeling like I hadn't slept a wink. Ethan was still out cold, sprawled across his bed. I envied him at that moment. I decided to head down to the kitchen, hoping some coffee would clear my head. The hotel was eerily quiet as I made my way downstairs. The only sound was the gentle hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. As I was brewing a pot of coffee, the silence was broken by the sound of footsteps. I turned to see Miss Sarah entering the kitchen, looking surprisingly composed for someone who was probably asleep, deprived as the rest of us. "Morning, Noah," she said, her voice calm. "Early bird." "Couldn't sleep," I mumbled, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "Am neither," she sighed, taking a seat at the kitchen table. "This place, it's got a strange energy, hasn't it?" I nodded, surprised that she felt it too. Maybe I wasn't going crazy after all. We sat in silence for a few minutes, sipping our coffee. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "So, about Alex," I began, unable to keep the question bottled up any longer. Miss Sarah looked at me, her expression unreadable. "He's not doing well," she said quietly. "He's been having nightmares. He's seeing things. I think it's best if he goes home." "But what about the note I found yesterday?" I blurted out, pulling the crumpled paper from my pocket. "The underground archive. Does that mean anything to you?" Ns. Sarah's eyes widened slightly as she took the note from me. She unfolded it carefully, her gaze scanning the faded words. "Veer, did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the storage room," I replied. "Knocked over a box of lettuce, and this fell out." She was silent for a long moment, her brow furrowed in thought. This changes things," she finally said, more to herself than to me. "I need to make a call." She rose abruptly and left the kitchen, the note still clutched in her hand. I watched her go, a sense of unease settling in the pit of my stomach. What did it all mean? The rest of the morning was a blur. People started to trickle into the kitchen, looking as exhausted as I felt. Ben was complaining about a crick in his neck, claiming the pillows were too soft. Chloe, Sarah, and Olivia were huddled together, whispering and giggling about something, their earlier enthusiasm seemingly restored. They were probably relieved that we were leaving this creepy place. Ethan finally emerged, looking like he'd been dragged through a hedge backward. He grumbled something about a nightmare involving giant, talking statues, which, given recent events, didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. We ate a quick breakfast, the atmosphere noticeably lighter than the previous day. It seemed like everyone was eager to get out of the hotel. Ms. Sarah was nowhere to be seen, which added to my growing sense of unease. After breakfast, I saw Michael helping Alex carry his suitcase downstairs. Alex looked pale and withdrawn, his eyes darting around nervously. He didn't meet my gaze. "You okay, Alex?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He just shrugged, his shoulders slumped. "Just tired," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. Michael gave me a sympathetic look. "He'll be all right," he said quietly. "Just needs to get home." They headed out the front door, and I watched them go, a strange mix of relief and apprehension washing over me. Part of me felt sorry for Alex, but another part couldn't shake the image of him, or whatever it was, standing in the hallway last night. A short while later, Ms. Sarah reappeared, looking grim. "All right, everyone," she announced. "We're leaving. Pack your bags. We're heading back to the city." A collective sigh of relief swept through the group. Everyone, except me, seemed happy to be leaving. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running from something we didn't understand, something far more sinister than a haunted museum or a creepy hotel. As we were packing, Ethan came up to me, a serious look on his face. "Dude," he said, lowering his voice, "I don't think that was Alex last night." I stared at him, my blood turning to ice. "What do you mean?" "I woke up again around 3 a.m., he explained, "and I saw you standing by the window, just staring out into the darkness. I called out to you, but you didn't respond. You just kept staring. Then, after a while, you turned around and..." He trailed off, his eyes wide with fear. "And what?" I prompted, my heart pounding. "It wasn't you, Noah," he whispered. "Your face, it was different. Empty somehow. Like something was wearing your skin." His words sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. It confirmed my worst fears. Something was very, very wrong. The fog, the disappearing building, the statue, the painting, Alex's strange behavior, the note, and now this. It was all connected somehow, and I had a sinking feeling that we were right in the middle of it. We left the hotel in a hurry, piling into the cars and driving away without a backward glance. As we drove, I kept looking out the back window, half expecting to see something chasing us, something emerging from the swirling fog that still blanketed the area. The drive back to the city was silent and tense. Everyone seemed lost in their own thoughts, grappling with the unsettling events of the past few days. Even Chloe, Sarah, and Olivia were unusually subdued, their usual chatter replaced by an uneasy quiet. As we approached the city limits, the fog began to dissipate, revealing the familiar skyline. It felt like we were entering a different world, a world where things like haunted museums and shifting entities didn't exist. But I knew the truth. We had brought something back with us, something that had latched onto us in that eerie hotel. And I had a feeling that our nightmare was far from over. The city lights, usually so comforting, now seemed to mock us, their brightness unable to penetrate the darkness that had settled in my heart. We were not safe. Not yet. Not by a long shot. The city, with all its hustle and bustle, felt just as menacing as that desolate, fog-choked hotel. Because whatever had followed us out there was now here, hidden among the millions of faces, waiting, watching. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was just the beginning. The days following our return to the city were a strange mix of normalcy and unease. Everyone tried to slip back into their routines, going to school, hanging out with friends, pretending that the trip to the museum had just been a weird, unsettling dream. But it was always there, lurking beneath the surface, a shared secret that bound us together in a web of fear and uncertainty. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the faces in the crowd, half expecting to see that comfy face Ethan had described, the one that wasn't mine but wore my skin. Sleep offered no escape, haunted by nightmares of shifting statues, burning figures, and a dark, ominous fog that seemed to seep into everything. One evening, about a week after we got back, I got a call from Ethan. His voice was shaky, panicked. "Noah, you need to come over. Right now. It's happening again." My blood ran cold. "What's happening?" "Just come," he pleaded. "Please." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my jacket and raced out the door, my mind buzzing with 1,000 terrifying possibilities. As I ran through the streets, the city lights seemed to blur and distort, taking on a sinister quality. The shadows seemed deeper, the sounds of the city more menacing. When I arrived at Ethan's apartment, the door was ajar. I pushed it open cautiously and stepped inside. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the flickering screen of the television. "Ethan," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. I found him in the living room, huddled on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. He looked awful pale, sweating, his eyes wide with terror. "It's here," he whispered, his gaze fixed on the screen. "It's in the apartment." I followed his gaze, my heart pounding. The TV was showing static, the image flickering and distorting. And then, for a split second, I saw it, a face, and rising from the static, a face that was both familiar and utterly alien. It was my face, but twisted, distorted, the eyes black and hollow. "It's using the TV," Ethan stammered, "just like it used the painting and the statue." The face on the screen seemed to grin, a slow, chilling smile that sent shivers down my spine. Then, the static returned and the face was gone. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died, plunging the apartment into darkness. A low, guttural growl echoed from the corner of the room. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We stumbled towards the door, our hands outstretched, trying to navigate in the darkness. The growling grew louder, closer. Just as we reached the door, something cold and clammy brushed against my hand. I recoiled, stifling a scream. We burst out of the apartment and into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind us. We could hear something pounding on the other side, the door frame shaking violently. We ran, not stopping until we were out of the building and onto the street. We didn't stop running, didn't look back. We ended up at a 24-hour diner a few blocks away, our chests heaving, our bodies trembling. We sat in a booth, the bright fluorescent lights a stark contrast to the darkness we had just escaped. "What was that thing?" Ethan asked, his voice still shaking. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I think it's connected to that place, to the hotel, to the underground archive." I told him about the note, about the missing delivery driver Max. We both agreed that we needed to find out more about the underground archive. It was the only clue we had. The next few days were a blur of frantic research. We scoured the internet, looking for any mention of the underground archive. We found nothing. It was like it didn't exist. Then, a breakthrough. Ethan found an old, archived news article online, a small, local piece from a town near where the hotel was located. It mentioned a series of strange disappearances, all linked to an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. The building was described as a former archive, a place where historical documents and artifacts were stored. The name of the archive was not mentioned in the article. We knew we had to go back. We borrowed Ethan's dad's car and drove back to the fog-shrouded town, the sense of dread growing with every mile. The town seemed even more desolate than before, the streets empty, the houses dark and silent. We found the abandoned building easily enough. It was a large, imposing structure, its windows boarded up, its walls covered in graffiti. A rusted sign hung precariously above the entrance, barely legible. The underground archive. We entered cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The building was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, filled with shelves upon shelves of decaying boxes and files. We searched for hours, our hope dwindling with each passing minute. Then, in a small, hidden room at the back of the building, we found it, a single, leather-bound book, tucked away on a bottom shelf. The book was old, its pages brittle and yellowed. The cover was blank, but on the first page, a single word was written in elegant script, Malachi. As we opened the book, a wave of cold air swept through the room, extinguishing our flashlights. We were plunged into darkness, and a low, guttural voice echoed through the room, whispering a name, Malachi, Malachi. We scrambled for our phones, our hands shaking as we turned on the flashlight apps. The light flickered to life, revealing the room and the book, lying open on the floor. We started to read. The book was a journal, written by a man named Max, the delivery driver mentioned in the note I had found. He wrote about the archive, about the strange artifacts they stored, about the growing sense of unease among the staff. He wrote about a specific artifact, an ancient artifact brought to the archive for safekeeping, an artifact called Malachi. According to the journal, Malachi wasn't just an object, it was a vessel, a container for something ancient and evil. Something that could possess people, twist their minds, and use them as puppets. Something that fed on fear and despair. Something that could take on the form of the people it possessed. The last entry in the journal was frantic, filled with terror. Max wrote about the disappearances, about the strange occurrences in the town, about the growing darkness that seemed to be seeping out of the archive and into the world. He wrote about his plan to destroy Malachi, to end the nightmare once and for all. But the journal ended abruptly, mid-sentence. Max had failed. Suddenly, a voice spoke from behind us, a voice we recognized, a voice filled with chilling malice. Looking for something, we spun around. Standing in the doorway was Ben. But it wasn't Ben, not really. His eyes were black, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. A cruel smile twisted his lips. Malachi likes to play games. The figure that looked like Ben said, its voice distorted, echoing. He likes to watch you squirm. We knew then that it was too late. Malachi had been released. It had followed us back to the city, feeding on our fear, growing stronger. And now it had found a new puppet. It had already possessed Alex and now Ben. The creature lunged at us, its movements unnaturally fast. We dodged, scrambling back, our hearts pounding in our chests. We were trapped, cornered in the heart of the archive, with a creature of unimaginable power. The creature that wore Ben's face stalked towards us, its black eyes burning with an unholy light. It was toying with us, enjoying our terror. You can't escape. It hissed, its voice a chorus of whispers. Malachi is everywhere now. He's in the fog, in the shadows, in your dreams. He's a part of you. Then it lunged again. This is where our story ends. We fought, but against such a creature, what hope did two terrified teenagers have? Did we escape? Did we find a way to stop Malachi? Or did we become just another pair of empty shells, vessels for an ancient evil? That I leave to you to decide. But one thing is certain, the darkness had found us, and the world would never be the same. The fog, the fear, the chilling emptiness, it was all just a prelude. The true horror had only just begun, and somewhere, out there in the shadows, Malachi was waiting, watching its tendrils of darkness slowly spreading, consuming everything in its path. The underground archive was no longer just a building. It was an idea, a terrifying reality, and it was here to stay. The game had begun. I gotta get this off my chest, but I can't use my real name or the name of the park where I work. I'm a park ranger, and some seriously messed up stuff went down. I'm talking the kind of stuff that could get me fired, or worse. But people need to know. I owe it to Sarah. That's not her real name, by the way. None of the names in this story are real. Gotta protect the, innocent, I guess. So, another day, another dollar, right? I show up at the ranger station like usual. They hand me my patrol area for the day, which, no joke, is usually like half the entire park. This place is massive. Think less, leisurely stroll, and more power, walking with a purpose, if you want to cover your whole section. I hop in my trusties and rusty work vehicle, a 10-year-old 4x4 that's seen better days, and head out. My job, basically, make sure no one's having a meltdown in the wilderness. And it usually doesn't take long to find someone who needs help. First up, some dude at the first campground couldn't get his camper started. No biggie, just a quick jump, and he's on his way. Next, a couple needed directions. Then a flipped canoe. Classic. I swear, I'd only made it a few miles into the park. At this rate, I was going to be out here all day. I managed to scarf down a few bites of my sad desk lunch. Gotta keep those energy levels up, and actually put some miles on the truck without any more SOS calls. That's when the radio crackled to life. Unit 7. We've got a hiker reporting something unusual. Need you to check it out, bot. Great. Just when I thought I might actually make some progress. 30 minutes later, I'm talking to this middle-aged lady, Brenda, who's looking pretty freaked out. She tells me she found a hat and a note on the trail. She hands me the note, and let me tell you, it was a doozy. It read, "Writing this note, 'cause I don't know what's going on. Me and my 4 best buds, we've been planning this camping trip since forever. Like way back before we even graduated. But it seemed like something always came up at the last minute. Someone couldn't make it, or there was some drama. For a while, I honestly thought we were cursed, like some outside force was keeping us from camping together until we were, 90 and using walkers on the trail. I can picture Ethan now, though. He'd still go, even if he was ancient. Dude's always up for camping. I think he keeps a fully loaded backpack in his car at all times, just in case. Lowell. Anyway, so we finally all made it. Ashley got here right after us, then Mark, and of course, Chris was the last one to show up. We hit the trail, super stoked. 3 miles in, the sun's starting to beat down, but we're making good time to the rustic campground. That's when Ethan decides we should take a detour. He says he heard about this old trail that no one uses anymore, and he wants to check it out. I was like, dude, no, let's just stick to the plan. But I got outvoted. I don't even think Chris's vote should have counted, since he was obviously high as a kite. Ethan totally just bullied him into saying yes. So, we come to this spot with a big rock off to the side of the trail. Ethan says it's the trailhead, but I don't see any trail. He leads us through some thick brush, but on the other side, it clears up, and you can kinda see the faint outline of a super overgrown trail. I went last and left my hat on the rock, just in case we got lost and needed to be rescued. And I'm starting to think that's exactly where we're headed, straight into being lost. I'm gonna leave this note under my hat and hope someone finds us. Brenda showed me where she found the note and hat. And let me tell you, my blood ran cold. 3 miles later, I'm staring at this rock I thought I'd never see again. A rock that brought back a whole lot of memories I'd tried to bury. I radioed in my location to the station, told them the whole story. I said if they didn't hear from me in a couple of hours, send a search party to the old abandoned trail. Here's the thing, though. My backpack, with all my essential gear, including my sidearm, was 3 miles away, back at the truck. And I had no idea how long these kids had been on this trail. Every minute counted. I knew that in a situation like this, wasted time could mean the difference between life and death. At least I had my knife, flashlight, and binocs. Small comforts, but better than nothing. So, I thanked Brenda, put the red hat back on the rock, just in case, and headed into the brush. The trail was barely visible at first, just like the note said. Old memories started flooding back, memories I really didn't want to think about. I took a deep breath and pushed forward. The trail was overgrown for the first mile or so, then it opened into a field. I could tell someone had been through here recently, by the way the weeds were trampled down. As I'm walking through this field, a deer jumps out right in front of me, nearly giving me a heart attack. I realized then just how on edge I was. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself these kids were probably just a little lost, and I'd catch up to them, no problem. But that didn't make the memories go away. Not one bit. The memories kept flooding back, no matter how hard I tried to push them away. I was really starting to miss my backpack, especially the water bottles. Hiking is thirsty work, even without the added stress of a potential rescue mission. The shade from the trees helped a little with the heat, but still, I was parched. The birds were chirping, a cheerful soundtrack that almost made me forget the seriousness of the situation. Almost. My mind drifted back to the kid I couldn't save. It was years ago, not long after I first started as a ranger. An 11-year-old boy, lost on this very trail. His parents were frantic, searching everywhere before they finally called us in. I remember hoping, praying, that I would be the one to find him. We formed search parties, combed every inch of the trail, inside and out. And in the end, I did find him. But it wasn't the happy ending I'd imagined. It was the worst possible outcome. I shook my head, trying to clear the image from my mind. I had to focus. This wasn't about the past. It was about the 5 kids who were out here now, somewhere on this godforsaken trail. The trail was getting harder to follow. The trampled weeds were less obvious, and I was starting to lose my way. Out here, that can be a death sentence. I pushed forward, my anxiety growing with each step. Just when I was about to lose all hope, I saw a scrap of paper, barely visible in the weeds. I grabbed it, my hands shaking. It was another note, okay. Maybe I was being a little dramatic before. This trail isn't so bad. Maybe I was wrong about Ethan. He seems to know where he's going. I just can't shake this feeling that we're being watched. Sometimes I'll look around, and I swear I see a face disappear behind a tree. Am I just being paranoid? Maybe if the birds would start singing again, it would lighten the mood. But I haven't heard a bird or any other animal for a while now. Why are they so quiet? Are they scared of us? On another note, Chris is being even more of a downer than usual. Maybe he forgot to bring enough weed for the trip. He's completely spaced out. Ethan's in his element, of course, since everyone's relying on him for directions. Ashley and Mark seem to be going along with it, but I've noticed Mark looking around at the trees a lot, too. Maybe I'll ask him if he's seen anything. If you're trying to track us down, I hope we're not being too much trouble. I just have this feeling. I folded the note, stuck it in my pocket, a knot forming in my stomach. She was right to be worried. I kept moving, the lack of water really starting to get to me. The sun was starting to dip below the trees. I still had no idea how far ahead these kids were. I could stumble across them in the next clearing, or they could be hours ahead. If their leader was so determined to push on, who knows how far they'd gone. The woman, Brenda, had found the first note in the afternoon. If they started out around daybreak, they could be a good 5 or 6 hours ahead of me, maybe more. Then I came to a fork in the road. 2 paths, both equally overgrown, equally indistinct. I searched for any sign, a broken twig, trampled grass, anything to tell me which way they'd gone. Nothing. Just when I was about to flip a coin and hope for the best, I spotted another piece of paper, almost hidden in the undergrowth. I snatched it up and read, "Well, we have a dilemma. A literal fork in the road." You'd think I'd be happy to see the look of doubt on Ethan's face as he stared at each path, but you'd be wrong. It just made my confidence plummet. It made me think we were never getting out of here. Everyone's running out of water. Ethan yelled at us for not conserving, but I saw him drink the last of his too. He ranted and raved, but we all knew he was just mad because he didn't know what to do. In the end, he flipped a coin. We all did our best not to laugh. Ashley's getting fed up with Ethan and his attitude. Mark's been playing peacemaker, trying to keep them from killing each other. Chris has been way too quiet. I haven't seen him light up once. Something's up with him, but every time I ask, he just mumbles, "It's nothing." The birds still aren't singing, and it's really starting to bother me. That weird feeling I had before hasn't gone away. I asked Mark if he'd seen anything strange, but he won't talk about it. We've been on this trail for hours. I'm hoping we reach the end soon. By the way, in case this note gets moved or blown around, we took the Loyalty trail. Relief washed over me. At least I knew which way to go. I radioed in again, reported my progress, mentioned the fork in the left turn. The response was not what I wanted to hear. Unit 7, there's no active search party at this time. You're the only one looking for those hikers. My heart sank. It was the complete opposite of the search for that boy all those years ago. Back then, everyone was searching. We turned the whole place upside down. But that's the thing about these woods. You can search every nook and cranny, and something can still stay hidden. I took the left path, the setting sun casting long, eerie shadows through the trees. I had to find these kids, and I had to do it alone. The sun was sinking fast, and I still had no clue how close I was to catching up with those kids. I could round the next bend and find them huddled around a dying fire, or they could be hours ahead, still trudging along this never-ending trail. It was getting dark, especially under the thick canopy of trees. I kept following the trail until I came to a fallen tree across a river. Looked both ways, no trail. So, I did what any sane person would do. I started inching my way across that thing. I could practically hear those kids arguing about whether to cross it. I chuckled to myself, picturing Ethan trying to convince them it was the right way, probably stomping his foot like a little kid. I made it across, no problem. Felt like I'd made up some serious time with that shortcut, too. I jumped down to the water's edge, drank my fill, tasted like heaven, and climbed back up, feeling a little more human. The trail was tough to pick up on the other side, naturally. But then, another stroke of luck. I found another note. This one stuck to a branch. Oh my gosh, Ethan nearly lost it when we got to that tree over the river. He just hopped right up on it and started across like it was no big deal. But the rest of us weren't so sure. We asked him how a trail could possibly have a fallen tree as part of it. He sputtered and stomped, going on about how lost we'd be without him. You know, the usual. Mark finally had enough. He told Ethan we were lost because of him. I seriously thought Ethan was gonna punch him, but then Chris, of all people, stepped in. He told Ethan to shut up. We all kind of ganged up on Ethan then. Told him he could keep leading, but he had to stop acting like a total jerk. He didn't take it well. He ended up telling us we could all go to hell. He just sat down on the log and refused to move. So, we took a break, refilled our water bottles in the river, which was actually really nice, and eventually Mark just said, "Let's go." And we did. We crossed the tree. Ethan followed, sulking like a 5-year-old. Mark and I talked about that weird disappearing face we thought we saw earlier. Neither of us has seen it again. At least the birds are back to singing. I couldn't help but chuckle again. Ethan sounded like a real piece of work, but that chuckle turned into a knot of worry. A deposed leader is a dangerous thing. I wondered how much that little mutiny had bruised Ethan's ego, and if he'd be looking for payback. It was getting dark fast. I had a decision to make. Set up camp for the night or keep going. If I camped, I could at least try to defend myself against whatever was lurking out there in the darkness. But if I kept moving, there was a chance, however slim, that I could catch up to the group before daybreak. It wasn't much of a decision, really. I hadn't come this far, hadn't plunged headfirst into the woods without even my basic supplies, to just give up now. These kids, I didn't even know them. But all I could think about was that boy, years ago. What if I'd kept searching through the night back then? Would he still be alive? Those thoughts, man, they can really eat you up. Most days, I can keep them at bay. But here in this same forest, so close to where it happened, no, I had to focus. If I was going to find these kids, I needed to keep moving. I stepped off the trail to take a leak, and that's when it happened. A metallic snap, followed by a searing pain shooting up my leg. I looked down and saw the teeth of a bear trap clamped around my ankle. I screamed. I fell to the ground, clutching my leg, rocking back and forth. The pain was excruciating. After a few minutes, the initial shock wore off, and I knew I had to get the damn thing off. I found a thick branch, and, gritting my teeth, I started prying the trap open, screaming with every inch. Finally, with one last burst of adrenaline, I got the trap off and threw it aside. I really didn't want to take my boot off, but I had to see how bad it was. It took every ounce of willpower. I had to unlace that boot and pull it off. My ankle was already swollen and a nasty shade of purple. I gently prodded the wound. No broken bones, as far as I could tell. Didn't mean I wasn't going to be limping for a month. but it did mean that I'd be buying this brand of boots for the rest of my life. These things were tough. Getting the boot back on was even worse than taking it off. More screaming, more sweating, more pain. But I knew I had to keep moving. I laced up the boot, found a sturdy branch to use as a crutch, and struggled to my feet. Each step was agony, but I forced myself to keep going, one painful step at a time. And of course, because the universe has a sick sense of humor, that's when I heard it. Footsteps, just off the trail, moving through the trees. Something was out there, stalking me. It knew I was injured, vulnerable. I leaned against a tree, holding my makeshift crutch like a weapon. The footsteps came closer. They paused, as if assessing the situation, then slowly continued their approach. They were deliberate, measured, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I heard it right next to the tree I was hiding behind. I whipped around, raising my crutch, ready to swing. A deer. A freaking deer. It stared at me for a heartbeat, then turned and bolted into the forest. I collapsed against the tree, sliding down to the ground, my body shaking with adrenaline and relief. I don't know how long I sat there. I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, something rough and wet was scraping against my face. I opened my eyes, and there it was, a bear, licking my cheek. Yeah, you can imagine my reaction. I screamed, scrambled away, my heart practically leaping out of my chest. The bear, thankfully, was just as startled as I was. It huffed, turned tail, and ran off. I sat there, catching my breath, trying to slow down my racing pulse. It was still dark, but the moon was providing a little bit of light. I checked my watch. Almost 4 in the morning. I had lost hours. I struggled to my feet, my ankle throbbing. I took out my small flashlight, clicked it on, and held my breath. Please, please work. A beam of light cut through the darkness. Small miracle. I panned the light around, trying to get my bearings. After a moment, I found the trail and started hobbling along, cursing myself for falling asleep. The night sounds were almost comforting now. Crickets chirping, owls hooting, at least it meant the predators, hopefully, were keeping their distance. I kept moving, the flashlight beam my only guide in the darkness. I couldn't stop thinking about the kids. Had I lost too much time? Would I be too late? The memory of the boy I'd failed to rescue all those years ago gnawed at me. What if the same thing happened again? What if I failed again? Sure, the ranger department might say I did my best, but that wouldn't mean anything. Could I live with myself if something happened to these kids? My thoughts were interrupted when I stumbled into a clearing. And not just any clearing. This one had the remnants of a fire, still smoldering. There were indentations in the ground where tent pegs had been. All the signs of a recent campsite. And there, still standing, was a single tent. My heart leaped with a mixture of hope and dread. Why was this tent still here? I called out, my voice hoarse. Hello? Is anyone there? No answer. I carefully approached the tent, my makeshift crutch sinking into the soft earth. This lone tent was a very bad sign, but I was able to find some much-needed supplies. The best score was a couple of protein bars and 2 full water bottles still in the pack. I devoured a protein bar and some jerky I found, washing it down with precious water. I also saw a note, weighted down with a rock, next to the dying fire. I held my hand out to the embers, still warm but fading fast. It had been hours since it was lit. If I hadn't taken that stupid nap, I would have been here hours ago. I probably would have caught up with them. There was nothing I could do about it now. I sat down heavily by the fire and unfolded the note, hoping for some good news. We found this clearing and decided to camp. Everyone was exhausted, and the mood was pretty grim. No one knew where we were. We'd all been hiking in this forest before, but none of us had ever seen or heard of this trail. We set up our tents, started a fire, had some dinner, and then just sat around. No one really felt like talking, so I tried to break the ice. I asked Chris why he was late getting here. He hesitated, but finally he told us that he'd hit an animal with his car on the way. I asked if it was a deer, and he said no, it was way too big to be a deer. He said it walked upright, on two legs, and it was huge, like 8 feet tall, covered in brown fur. He said he swerved, but the weirdest thing was, it seemed like it wanted him to hit it. Like it was trying to jump in front of his car. We all listened, totally creeped out. Then, off in the distance, we heard a scream. We all froze. Ethan started yelling at Chris, accusing him of trying to scare us. Then he just stormed off into the woods. Mark tried to stop him, but Ethan shoved him away and disappeared into the darkness. The rest of us talked, trying to decide if we should go after him. We figured we should just let him cool off. A little while later, we heard a rustling in the woods, and then a muffled cry. We huddled closer together, on high alert. We kept looking around, searching the wall of trees around us, trying to see if anything was out there. Then the strangest thing happened. All the night noises just stopped. The crickets, the squirrels, the owls, everything. It was like someone had flipped a switch. It was so unsettling. For a second, I thought maybe I'd gone deaf. We were all freaking out, huddled around the fire. Mark pulled out his hunting knife. No one said a word. It was like if we spoke, something bad would happen. Like whatever had made the noises stop would find us if we made a sound. Then someone did speak. But it wasn't who we expected. "Why are you here?" a deep, raspy voice said. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. We looked around, and finally a man stepped into the light of the fire. He was huge, well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders. Older, maybe in his 50s or 60s, and he was wearing a park ranger's uniform. It looked old and worn, like he'd been wearing it for a long, long time. There was no NAMA tag or park patches, though. At that point, we didn't care. We thought we were saved. We all started talking at once, telling him how glad we were that he'd found us, how lost we were. The man just listened. Then he slowly said, "You shouldn't be here." We all looked at each other. I'm sure the others were thinking the same thing I was. "No duh, we shouldn't be here. We just told you that." Bah, he kept looking at us one by one, like he was sizing us up. It was starting to make me uncomfortable, his silence. I thought he'd offer to help us, guide us out, but he didn't. He just kept staring. I think everyone else was getting edgy too. Finally, Mark asked if he could point us in the right direction. He looked at Mark for a long time, like he was deciding whether or not to answer. Then he said, "I can guide you." but first, you should rest." We all agreed. It had been a long, stressful day. We offered him some food and water, but he refused, saying he wasn't hungry. We each went to our tents. Before I settled in, I peeked out. The ranger was sitting by the fire, staring into the coals. I thought I heard him mumbling, or maybe humming, something real soft. I zipped up my tent and went to sleep. Sometime later, someone banged on my tent. I woke up and unzipped it. It was the ranger. He had this crazy look in his eyes. "We need to go," he said. I asked, rubbing the sleep out of my eyes. "It's not safe here," he said, a hint of panic in his voice. I went back inside to change, then came out. Everyone else was up too, looking just as confused as I was. The ranger was the only one who seemed to know what was going on. "Pack up. We need to leave now," he said, more forcefully this time. I was about to protest, but then we heard it, a piercing scream in the distance. The ranger's head snapped up. He stared in the direction of the scream. "Move it," he said. "Pack up now." We didn't need to be told twice. That scream woke us up faster than any alarm clock. We tore down our tents in record time, stuffed everything into our backpacks. As I was finishing up, I noticed Ethan's tent was still up. "Where's Ethan?" I asked. "Who's Ethan?" the ranger asked. "He's another one of our friends," I said. "He went off into the woods alone right before you got here. He didn't come back," the ranger said flatly. "Should we look for him?" I asked. The ranger just spread his arms wide, gesturing to the dark woods around us. "Which way would you go?" he asked. He had a point. How would we know where Ethan had gone? It just felt wrong to leave him. "What about his gear?" I asked. "Should we take it with us?" The ranger looked at me like I was the dumbest person on the planet. "Leave it," he said. "He'll need his supplies if he comes back." I'm not sure if I'll keep leaving notes or not, now that we have this ranger to guide us. Whoever finds this, please look for Ethan. Make sure he's okay. A ranger? What the hell was going on? All the rangers at this park are accounted for, and in their 30s or 40s. Was this some retired ranger just wandering around out here? But why the uniform? And why was he acting so strange? I sat there by the dying embers of the fire, staring at the empty tent. Rest sounded amazing. If these kids were in the hands of another ranger, maybe I could afford a little shut-eye. But I knew I'd already taken my rest for the night. A decision that had probably cost me precious hours. I had to keep going. I got up, my ankle screaming in protest. I zipped up the empty tent. Wouldn't want any critters getting in there and making a mess of Ethan's stuff, just in case he did come back. It's bad enough an injured park ranger had helped themselves to his supplies. I left the campsite, feeling tired but more determined than ever. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, but it was still pretty dark under the trees. I used my flashlight to follow the trail, which thankfully was pretty easy to spot after the campsite. The trail started to climb, which was just great news for my throbbing ankle. It was slow going, but I had my trusty branch crutch to help me along. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, I didn't have to rely on my flashlight as much. Silver linings, right? The climb got steeper, and the trail got narrower. At some points, it was barely wide enough for 1 foot. I had to grab onto trees, roots, anything I could find, to keep from sliding down the slope. I came to one particularly nasty section, so narrow and steep that I seriously considered turning back. It looked like a one-way ticket to a broken neck. As I stood there, debating my sanity, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A flash of color, down at the bottom of the ravine. I carefully balanced myself, took out my binoculars, and focused on the spot. It was a backpack, and attached to that backpack was the body of a young woman. My breath caught in my throat. She was lying face down, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. Her clothes were ripped and stained with what I knew was blood. Her face, I could see even from here that it was badly mauled. An animal had definitely gotten to her. The only question was, had she been alive when it happened? I lowered the binoculars, my stomach churning. I felt a renewed sense of urgency. These kids might be with a ranger, but they were still in grave danger. I forced myself to keep moving, inching my way up the narrow trail. Every step was a struggle, and I was constantly terrified that the ground would give way beneath me, sending me tumbling down to join that poor girl. That's when I remembered my radio. I pulled it out, switched it on, and tried to call in. I reported the location of the body, the steep ravine, everything. But all I got was static. Great, just great. I decided to try again when I got to the top. One more reason to keep pushing forward. It felt like it took hours, but finally I reached the top. I practically crawled over the edge, collapsing onto solid ground, gasping for breath. After a few minutes, I managed to get up, my legs shaking. I found the trail again and started following it. It wasn't long before I came across another campsite, or what was left of one. The fire was still warm, warmer than the last one. I threw some more wood on, got it blazing again. I knew I needed a rest, but I also knew I couldn't afford to stop for long. I searched around and, just like before, found another note. I sat down on a log by the fire and started to read. I can't believe Ashley's gone. We started up this steep ravine, and the trail kept getting narrower and narrower. I asked the ranger if there was another way around, but he just glared at me and said no. We were all struggling with our heavy packs on. At one point, I was on my hands and knees, just trying not to slide off the edge. That's when it happened. Ashley was having a really hard time. She kept slipping. I reached out and helped her a few times. I was right in front of her, so I kept an eye on her when I could. But I had to watch my own footing too. She slipped again, and I tried to grab her, but she'd already tipped over. The weight of her backpack just dragged her over the side. I watched in horror as she tumbled down the ravine, bouncing off trees on the way down. I saw her head hit a rock hard. She finally landed at the bottom and just didn't move. I called her name, but she didn't respond. I yelled for the ranger. He was ahead of us. I pointed to Ashley's body. He just stared at her for the longest time. I don't know if he was trying to see if she was alive or not. Finally, he told us to keep going, to get to the top. He said he'd go down and check on her. I watched him carefully make his way down the slope. It was practically vertical. We kept moving, like he said. He was only halfway down when we made it to the top. I was a mess. I was so relieved we made it, but so devastated about Ashley. I knew deep down that she was gone. There was no way the ranger was going to come strolling back into camp with her on his back, saying she just had a few bumps and bruises. We started a fire and just sat there in shock. Finally, Mark came over and talked to me. "Look," he said, "I know she was your best friend, but she was our friend too. We need to stick together to get out of here, for her bar." "That's so stupid, it makes sense," I said, trying to smile. That's when the ranger reappeared. He sat down by the fire and didn't say a word. There was something in his eyes. It wasn't sadness. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't sadness. We all knew Ashley wasn't coming back. We rested for a little while, then started out on the trail again. "If you're following us, please be careful. Stay safe." This girl, she was something else. Even after everything she'd been through, she was still worried about my safety. I had to find her. My guilt, which had been simmering in the background, suddenly roared back to life. How could I sit here and rest when these kids were out there alone, scared, and now, after finding Ashley, probably injured? I pushed myself to my feet, ignoring the stabbing pain in my ankle. I kicked dirt over the fire, extinguishing the flames, and set off again. The daylight was fading, but it was only 8 in the morning. I looked up and saw why. Dark clouds were rolling in, thick and heavy. Another reason to curse myself for leaving my backpack behind. The first raindrops began to fall, cold and stinging. It wasn't just a light shower, either. It was a full-on downpour. I was soaked to the bone in minutes. The trail turned to mud, making each step treacherous. The mud was starting to cake on my boots. My ankle was throbbing. This was just perfect. And then, through the driving rain, I saw it. A tent. Salvation. I practically threw myself at the tent, fumbling with the zipper in my haste. "Hello," I called out. "Anyone in there?" No answer. I unzipped the tent and crawled inside, collapsing onto the thankfully dry floor. I quickly zipped it back up, shutting out the worst of the storm. I leaned back against a pack, breathing heavily, grateful for the temporary shelter. But as I did, a full stench assaulted my nostrils. I looked over and saw a sleeping bag zipped up tight. But it was lumpy and misshapen, and there were dark stains on it. Blood. "I'm sorry to barge in like this," I said to the lump in the sleeping bag, "but I really needed to get out of the rain." No response. I reached out and nudged the bag. It tipped to the side, then rolled right back. That's when I noticed the dark red splotches that had soaked through the fabric. I didn't want to. I really didn't, but I had to know. I reached for the zipper and slowly pulled it down. The smell hit me first, the coppery tang of blood mixed with something else, something rotten. Then I saw the face, or what was left of it. It had been ripped away, the flesh torn, the bone exposed. The neck was a mangled mess. There were deep gashes on the body, too. It was clear that whatever had done this was no ordinary animal. I felt for a pulse, even though I knew it was pointless. My fingers sank into the torn flesh of the neck, and I gagged, pulling my hand back as if I'd been burned. I wiped my fingers on the sleeping bag, my mind reeling. Why was the body covered up? It didn't make sense. Then I saw it. A note, tucked under the edge of the sleeping bag. "I can't believe Chris is dead." I wish I'd never come on this trip. I wish I'd never let Ethan bully us into turning down this damn trail. Where the hell is Ethan, anyway? When he stormed off on his little pity party, did he run into whatever creature has been stalking us? Is he sitting back in his tent now, enjoying himself? I really don't know. We were enjoying not climbing up the face of a ravine, but we were tired. I mentioned stopping to camp to the ranger. He looked around, even sniffed the air. That seemed weird. But then he agreed. He even told us to set up camp as quickly as we could. We gathered wood for a fire, but he told us not to bother. That rain was coming. I guess that explains the sniffing the air thing. Our tents had been up maybe 15 minutes when it started raining. It quickly turned into a downpour. We all offered to let the ranger sit in our tents with us. He looked at each of us, one by one. It was creepy. Finally, he said he'd sit with Chris in his tent. Mark and I looked at each other, relieved. The ranger is helping us, but he's not someone I'd ever want to see again. He just acts too weird. Sometimes I wonder if he's really helping. I just closed my eyes, listening to the rain on the tent. When the ranger ripped open my tent flap, he said we had to pack up and leave right now, that something was hunting us. We scrambled out into the rain and started packing up our tents. He said there was a cave nearby, that we could shelter there. As I was packing, I noticed Chris wasn't around. I went over to his tent and knocked. When there was no answer, I went in. And that's when I found him. What was left of him. Something had torn him to shreds. I covered my mouth to keep from throwing up and ran out to tell the others. Mark and the ranger looked in, saw that there was no helping him. The ranger said he had left the tent to go to the bathroom, and when he came back, he saw a predator hanging around the tents. That's when he came one and woke us. It must have already gotten to Chris. I pulled Chris's sleeping bag over his head. I wished we had time for a proper burial, but the ranger said the animal might come back for us. So we quickly packed and left. I barely had time to finish this note. Please help us. A cave. What kind of ranger leads a group of terrified hikers to a cave, of all places? Didn't he realize that's where a large predator would most likely make its den? Then it hit me. I knew this trail. I hadn't been on it in 5 years, not since the boy. But I remembered. We were close, very close to the place where we found him. Why would he take them there? Unless... I jumped up, forgetting my injured ankle. A searing pain shot through my leg, and I nearly collapsed on top of the body. I grabbed my crutch and stumbled out of the tent, into the still pouring rain. I had to get to that cave. I pushed myself as hard as I could, my ankle throbbing with every step. The rain was blinding, but I knew where I was going. Finally, through the downpour, I saw it, the dark opening of the cave, and just inside the entrance, 2 backpacks. I pulled out my knife and my flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. I cautiously approached the cave entrance. I felt a change in the wind. I turned, and there he was. The ranger. He was just standing there, staring at me. I looked him up and down, taking in the old uniform, the lack of any identifying marks. You, I said, my voice trembling slightly. The last time I saw you was when we found the boy. He didn't say anything, just kept staring. It was never a random animal attack, I said, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. It was you. He took a step toward me. Of course, it was, he said, his voice low and menacing. How wonderful was it to watch you all those years ago, as you floundered around, looking for some predator that stood right beside you. You son of a bitch. I held up my knife. He just smiled. Do you really think that little knife can hurt me? I looked at the knife in my hand. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. Pretty sure, I said. It's made of iron. His smile vanished. So you do know what I am? I pulled out a water bottle, the one I'd taken from Ethan's tent. I made sure to grab some runoff from the rain, I said. It might not do as good as rust water, but let's find out. I opened the bottle and threw the water at him. He dodged it with an unnatural speed, hissing as a few drops landed on his arm. At the same time, I lunged forward, slashing at him with the knife. He was too fast, though. He easily evaded my attack. Why don't you turn into the big pussy that you are? I taunted him. Because we both know that when I transform, I'm vulnerable for a moment, he said, circling me. And I'm sure you would love to take advantage of a vulnerable moment. He swung at me, a powerful blow that connected with my ribs. I gasped. The air knocked out of me. I stumbled back, clutching my side. I recovered and swung the knife again, a vicious downswing aimed at his head. He ducked under it with ease. I kept pressing forward, stabbing and slashing, but I couldn't get close enough to land a solid blow. He was just too fast, too agile. You can't defeat me, he said, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. Look at you like an injured deer, just waiting to be devoured. Be quiet, you Nald Lushi, I yelled. I used his true name. It was a risk, but I hoped it would give me an edge. He froze, just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough. I lunged at him, knife extended. If I had been uninjured, I would have closed the distance in 2 quick steps, buried the knife in his heart. But in the heat of the moment, I forgot about my injured ankle. I stepped forward on my good leg, but when I tried to put weight on my injured one, I faltered. Instead of plunging the knife into his heart, I drove it into his thigh. He screamed, a horrible, inhuman sound. He staggered back, clutching his leg. Then, with a burst of speed, he turned and fled out of the cave. I quickly shone my flashlight to the back of the cave. There, amidst a pile of bones, was another mutilated body and a final note clutched in her hand. I sat down, took it, and read. I can't believe how stupid I was not to see this sooner. All this time he was just leading us on. He never wanted to help us. He never cared about us or our safety. I need to write this quickly before he comes back. The ranger led us here and told us to wait, that we'd be safe in the cave. He left us alone. Mark pulled out his flashlight and explored deeper into the cave. He found a large pile of bones. Off to the side was a pile of clothes. We ran toward the opening, but the ranger had returned. So you didn't listen, he said, leering at us. I told you to stay here, not explore my home. What are you? I asked. He smiled for the first time since I'd met him, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was terrifying. I watched in horror as he changed. He grew larger, his features shifting, morphing into something monstrous. He became a giant cat-like creature, but it didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen. He lunged at us. He was so fast. He grabbed my leg, his claws sinking deep into my flesh. I screamed and fell to the floor. Mark tried to defend me, swinging his knife, trying to keep the creature at bay. But it stalked around him, cornering him. He only had one chance. He looked at me, his eyes filled with sadness. Then he ran past the creature and out of the cave. It looked at me, at my injured leg. Then it sprinted out after Mark. I know why he did it. He was trying to give me time to escape. But with my leg, there was no way I could outrun that thing. What he actually did was give me time to say goodbye. If you're reading this, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I led you to your death. If you somehow survive, please tell our families what really happened here. Goodbye. Tears streamed down my face as I read Sarah's final words. I limped to the front of the cave. The rain had stopped. The clouds were parting, revealing a sliver of blue sky. It was like a whole new world. I pulled out my radio and tried again. This time I got through. Unit 7 to dispatch. Do you copy? Dispatch here, Unit 7. Go ahead. I need immediate assistance at my location. Multiple casualties. Requesting backup and medical personnel. I gave them my coordinates, told them everything. I'm still a park ranger, even months later. I made sure that trail was sealed off. No one else is ever going down there. I carry an iron knife and a squirt gun filled with rust water with me at all times. You never know. The bones were removed from the cave and sent for DNA testing. Aside from Sarah's group and Ethan, there were remains from several other people who had gone missing in the park over the years. The official story is that a rogue animal was responsible. I was told it would be best for my career if I didn't reveal the true nature of the predator. But I know what I saw. I know what I fought, and I'm still looking for him. I post signs everywhere, warning people to be on the lookout for an older ranger in an outdated uniform, with no name tag or patches. There's a number to call if anyone spots him. It's my personal cell phone number. From time to time I hear reports of a large, cat-like creature limping on its hind leg. I always rush to the location, hoping to finally catch him. But so far, he's eluded me. I wrote this story for Sarah, a brave girl who deserved better. And as a warning, never go on an unposted trail, and be wary of those you meet in the woods, even if they're wearing a uniform.